Three. So welcome to the unit on criminal intelligence. And what I want to do with this video is look at how the decline in crime over the last 30 years in the United States, and what are the causes? Why did we see that decline? And we saw a decline in crime, and then we saw an uptick in crime starting in 2020, and we've seen that decline, that uptick go back down. So that's kind of off the chart here. But I want to start off with this chart with the good news that crime, the top line is property crime, the bottom line is violent crime, went down significantly. Both went down significantly starting around 1990s, and then just really just decelerated down up to the present day. And this is probably one of the great uh, achievements in policy, if you want to attribute it to policy, that we've had. How many lives have been saved? How many cities have now been able to grow? How many people, even in the poorest parts of the cities, were not victimized by crime because of this massive decline in crime? And it just goes to show you when we have a slight uptick, we're suddenly starting to talk about crime waves and crime infesting our communities, when in fact it was nothing compared to what we saw in the 80s or the 70s and 80s up to the early 90s. So why? Why have we seen that decline in crime? Well, many people have attributed it to better policing. Uh, the CompStat program that you read about, which led to more accountability, better technology, better intelligence, better focused policing, and that has led to this decrease in crime. That is one theory. The somewhat disgraced Rudy Giuliani, who was the mayor of New York when many of these decreases in crime, has espoused that. He's consulted and made a lot of money on that. And he said that, yes, better policing led to that decline in crime. Well, that's partially true, but can we really say that? We've seen that decline that we saw. Yeah, it might have started in New York, but that decline happened in other cities too. That decline happened in other Western countries as well that didn't reform their police services. So you have to look at, okay, when CompStat, when other aspects were pushed in, and did you see a decline in crime in that city or in that state? And the data doesn't really show that. This kind of decline in crime happened almost simultaneously throughout most of in the United States and even worldwide. So others have said mass incarceration and broken windows, which is kind of related to better policing. Broken windows is a theory on policing that said that you arrest people for low-level crimes, for turnstile jumping, shoplifting. You put 3 strikes and out, so you put them in jail for longer periods of time. You have an increased number of people incarcerated during this time because of the petty drug criminals or petty theft. And people have attributed that, yes, when you lock those people up, then there's less crime out there. And that, again, you saw in the Vox article, that might have had a small contribution, but there's, again, two issues with that. One, mass incarceration is a very, very blunt instrument that causes injuries in communities, causes all sorts of issues, and just you're robbing people of their essentially their freedom for low-level crimes. Only now are we looking at that and wondering, 3 strikes are out. Did we really need to lock people up for 20, 30 years for criminal activity they did in their early 20s? That's the first issue. The second issue is we saw this decline in other Western industrialized countries, and they didn't engage in the same mass incarceration that the United States did. And again, their incarceration rates are far lower than in the United States. yet they saw this decline in crime. So maybe mass incarceration for a couple of percentages for the decline in crime, but maybe not as an attribute, and certainly a very blunt instrument. Others have attributed the economy. The economy boomed in the 90s. Ask your parents about it. It was probably the largest economic expansion until recently. Wages were up, employment was down, or unemployment was down. Everyone could find a job, so they didn't have to go to other criminal activity to meet their basic needs. This is great in theory, and it probably had something to do it, but again, the economic boom really happened in the late 90s, and you still start to see that decline in crime in the early 90s when we were in a recession. Two, you see during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, crime still declines going forward. Crime kept going down during those economic malaise. So you'd expect crime to pop up, but no, crime kept going down. So did a booming economy help? Maybe a little bit, but again, on the margins. And I would also remind you, in the 90s were great for the United States, but other industrialized countries, Japan, Germany, Italy, they went through recessions during that time, yet their crime levels still went down. So yeah, maybe a couple of points, and maybe some of these actions interact with each other, but again, you can't just say a great economy led to this decline in crime. Next point, mental health treatments. Mental health, you'll hear about deinstitutionalization, which happened in the 50s and 60s, that people were let out of mental institutions at that time, and they were never, there was no way to treat them, and that led to the spike in crime in the 60s, 70s, and only with the advent of better medications, better mental health treatments, better treatments, did we see that decline in crime. Now, can you attribute this? Possibly. There were problems when we deinstitutionalized in the 50s, and that led to a spike, and then you see the spike recede. But again, that's assuming that all these people that were let out of mental hospitals were perpetrating crimes. In fact, people who are mentally ill tend to be the victims of crimes much more than the perpetrators of it. So again, maybe a percentage or two on the margins, but not a really big issue. Demographics. This is probably a larger issue. And this has to do with crime and the age people have in crime. And crime is essentially a young man's game. People who are young, teenagers, early adult, and then people tend to age out of crime. They tend to age out of terrorism. They tend to age out of all the bad things that are done. So people age out of that, and the demographics would say that the baby boomer generation, again, the baby boomer generation hit peak, in that teen, 20, 30 years old, in the 70s or 60s and 70s. So you saw the increase in crime, and then they aged out of crime. And our demographics are, we no longer have a youth bulge in our country. So that might explain it. And that probably does have a partial explanation. But again, the baby boom was in the United States. You certainly didn't have baby booms in other industrialized countries as well. So that has something to do with it. I suspect it has something to do with some other areas, but again, that you can't attribute that to demographics. Abortion. This is the most controversial one, and I'm not going to go into pro-life or pro-choice. I don't want to go into that, but this is the Freakonomics argument that said, because people were aborted, because Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in the 1970s, because people were aborted, they did not those people would not be committing crimes 20 years down the line. So Roe v. Wade happens in the 1970s. A lot of unwanted pregnancies are ended. Those babies never grew up to be teenagers, unwanted teenagers, and hence you had a decline in crime. Interesting theory, but there's problems with that as well. One, abortions were widespread before Roe v. Wade in places like New York and other areas. And the age theory doesn't always line up as neatly as that. But we're about to test that theory as abortion becomes a lot more illegal in our country. Are we going to see a subsequent crime 20 years down the line? Lead. Lead, many of you might are probably too young to remember this, but there was lead in paint. There was lead in gasoline. There was lead all over the place. And that, we know now studies that lowered IQ and maybe led people to engage in nefarious activity. Interesting theory. Again, it somewhat lines up. I don't know how much you can attribute the decline in crime when we eliminated lead, but that might be an interesting, another couple of points down the line. No cash. Ask your parents, but the number one property crime when they were growing up would be pickpockets or purse snatchers. Because at one point you had to carry thousands of dollars with you or hundreds of dollars because there was no ATM machines. So you went to the bank, got all your money, put all your money in your wallet, and that would be a lucrative target for criminals. Nowadays, pickpocketing doesn't pay, purse snatching doesn't really pay. And the fact that doesn't happen, that there's no cash anymore, or people don't carry as much cash, can attribute to some of the decline in property crime. This does probably have some impact, but I will also just say that murders declined, violent robberies declined, all sorts of violence declined in this aspect. So, we have these theories. Again, the Vox article goes into much more detail, but it's not clear, again, that these are the primary drivers of crime. Now, there's one argument made by Steven Pinker who looks at the decline, not just in crime, but in violence, whether it's everything from warfare to corporal punishment to executions. And all of those aspects have declined throughout the world. And he argues that crime is one of those aspects that has also gone, not necessarily because of any of these factors that I talked about, but because he says it, and it's a little pejorative, but he calls it a civilizing process, meaning that essentially crime, war, corporal punishment doesn't pay. And I don't like the term civilizing because that's kind of a imperialistic view, but those are his words. But his argument is, again, we've come to as a society to realize that crime doesn't pay. And that is partially or largely true. In fact, drug dealing, when you realize it's going to cause you to die in a couple of years, you might go on a better path. Putting effort into getting a job is actually going to probably pay off a lot more than petty drug dealing or petty theft. So that's his argument as well. It's hard to quantify, but his argument is that's what has led to the mass decrease in crime. So, curious what your thoughts are. And what I want to wrap this up with is, if we're going to say there's a decrease in crime, what led to the spike in crime in 2020? And there's a lot of theories on that. One, COVID-19 kept us inside, kept us maybe angry, frustrated, job losses, less activity for youth. So we saw that increase in crime. Problem is we didn't have, other countries didn't have that increase in crime. That's essentially that spike that you see there in 2020 is an American phenomenon. We did have the 2020 protests, the racial protests in response to the George Floyd murders. And I'm not arguing one way or another on those, but there were many more opportunities for crime, potential criminal activity, arguably the police pulled back, allowing for some criminal activity to occur. That might have contributed a bit. But again, is it where we're taking better records or that better looking at better data, or was it reflecting of something other larger happening? The Atlantic has argued that the crime spike is occurred because of justice delayed, that in 2020, because the courts were delayed, crime spiked because you couldn't get a court date, because we released people out of jail because of, to prevent overcrowding in the COVID time frame. Their argument is that in order for crime to decrease or stay at the low levels, you have to have immediate action. You shoplift at 9 o'clock, you're in jail, or have a court date or something at 9 o'clock the next day. Couldn't happen in COVID, and many have argued that is one of the reasons for the increase in crime. So again, when you're looking at this, look at this as like a social scientist. What are the variables? What are the independent, dependent variables? What worked, what didn't, how it was employed, so you can come up with a better answer. Okay, so that's